Okay, bonjour tout le monde. Welcome everybody to this session on embedding the SDGs at the core of business, from following to leading. My name is Daphne Yong-Davey. I'm Director in Global Policy at the International Chamber of Commerce, which is a global business organization which was founded to promote peace to trade. And I'll be moderating the session today. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015 to create a roadmap for the world, a roadmap towards more sustainable and inclusive development and towards the eradication of poverty. This was a very ambitious roadmap, which requires everybody, all sectors of society, to take part, and including economic actors. But the SDGs are a very long-term vision towards a common goal for the common good, whereas the current economic model tends to prioritize short-term profits and competition for individual gains. So how can companies reconcile these two visions? So today we're going to see and discuss how companies can do this, what they're doing to try and balance these different expectations, and also to discuss what the solutions are to try and help them go further and try to bring more companies on board. So we have a great panel, a group of people today to have this conversation. We have Stéphanie Dupuis-Lyon, who's Chief Sustainability Officer from the group La Poste. So she can tell us a little bit from the internal perspective of companies. We have Ken Shibusawa, who's a senior advisor with the Brunswick Group, who represents the sector of the long-term impact investment. And then we have Kimberly Abbott, who's the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Vested Impact, which provides tools to help the companies go forward on this journey. So this session will be in English and French, so you may need your translation facilities. So I'm going to start with you, Stéphanie. Donc Stéphanie, vous êtes ingénieure agronome des ponts, des eaux et des forêts. Vous avez eu plusieurs fonctions au sein du gouvernement français.
You've held several functions at the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, in the Sustainable Development Ministry, and in ecological transition. After a first position at La Poste, you went back just this year to start being the Chief Sustainability Officer. So you are the internal champion of sustainability within your company. What does this sustainable development mean today for La Poste and for companies in general? And how can we embed the SDGs with all the expectations from shareholders, employees, and customers? I know that La Poste has a special status. In France, it is a company with a public mission. Does it help you? Good afternoon to each one of you. I'm glad for being part of this panel. And thank you, Daphne, for these first questions. So what does sustainability mean for a company or a company such as La Poste?
À l'origine, une agronome, une ingénieure du vivant.
I am an agronomist, an engineer of the living. So for me, sustainability is a major challenge, which is being able to live on planet Earth. It is the overarching objective, because without a living planet, there will be no women and men, there will be no companies, no profit, nothing. So for me, sustainability is this issue of being able to live on our planet.
La question de la planète vivante, il y a
behind this issue of a living planet are the environmental issues. And I also like saying that it's not just greenhouse gases and carbon and decarbonation cchallenges, but I put this on the same level as
en matière de diminution des gaz à effet de serre, ce défi climatique.
climate challenge, where I put on the same level the collapse in biodiversity, which is a fundamental question. It is sort of the twin crisis, twin with the climate crisis, and I believe there's another major issue as an economist. It is the issue of the limited resources. We don't have unlimited resources, and so it's this shift towards reuse and recycling. So it's the use of resources.
Une planète vivante, c'est maintenir l'habitabilité de la planète et c'est à minima d'un point de vue environnemental une question du carbone, une question de biodiversité et une question de ressources
it's a question of resources, of biodiversity, and of carbon and greenhouse gas.
C'est aussi une question d'humanité.
I also talked about livability, being able to live here.
Il faut un socle social, un socle sociétal.
It's not just living on this planet as men and women. It is a social basis, being alongside impoverished people. It's also an issue of governance. In addition to the environmental challenges, we cannot forget society and social challenges for a company to be sustainable. Another element I wanted to share with you, Daphne, is that I don't feel that there's sustainability on the part of companies and sustainability for citizens or for governments. This challenge is a collective challenge if we want to live on this planet. So I believe that we should all work in the same direction and share this common challenge. We need everyone on board. There's an impetus on the part of companies. Governments, including in France, already made commitments, and so did citizens. But now we really need to act collectively. And we all see the end of the month and the end of the world coming faster towards us, and that should also be mentioned. Then you asked me about a group such as La Poste. Is it complicated to have this challenge of sustainability alongside the challenge of profitability? La Poste is a company. It's a company with shares, but we have public shareholder, which is aware that profitability cannot go without responsibility. So at La Poste, we believe that there cannot be profitable growth without responsible growth. So we will not maximize profits at all costs, because it's not a responsible thing to do, and in the long run, it is not profitable. And we're lucky enough to have this public shareholder supporting us. I know that in other parts of the world and for other companies, the role of shareholders can be quite negative regarding ESG criteria and commitments. I know that is really a little bit different for us at La Poste. We are a logistics company. We are going to have our 20,000th electric vehicle. We have one of the largest fleet in the world and one of the largest in decarbonation shift. So every day we make decarbonation choices with significant investments, but we always do this pragmatically and realistically. We have to stay profitable, so there's a pace for our investments that we need to have. And indeed, you mentioned that since 2021 we received a mission as a company. Only 1,000 companies in France took up this status. It's 0.2% of French companies, and a lot of these companies are small and medium-sized companies. So large companies such as La Poste, there are probably only about 10 of us with this mission. We made 4 commitments towards society, on demographic challenges, environmental challenges, and also digital challenges. And we implemented KPIs to assess our impact. It's a flexible and agile status. We are the first generation of companies who took this up, and we believe that CSRD is going to help us keep moving towards sustainability and impact. Thank you, Stephanie, for underlying the importance of collective effort.
I think Stephanie mentioned investment quite a few times, and I think investors have a huge influence on how companies work. You have a long experience in long-term impact investment, and you've founded several investment and advisory companies and several funds as well focused on Japan and Africa. You're also a board member of the International Foundation for Valuing Impact, a special advisor to the International Sustainability Standards Board, and a member of Prime Minister Kishida's Council on New Capitalism, as well as the UNDP SDG impact. So you're really at the heart of this question. So as a long-term investor who's worked for many, many years trying to encourage companies to look more long-term, how do you encourage businesses to really invest in this long-term vision of the SDGs? And what tools and support do you think companies need? And is long-term impact investing gaining momentum?
Right. Thank you, Daphne, for that introduction. When you say investors, there's lots of investors, different types of investors, and there are short-term investors and long-term investors. Now, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I used to work for investment banks in the U.S., hedge fund, United States based, not very long-term. But as I was turning 40 years old back in 2001, a couple things happened. I was starting a new company, I was starting a family, and 9/11 happened, and that to me that was a wake-up call for what I consider now as sustainability. You just can't leave it up to the government to fix problems; that the private sector needed to get involved in their own way. And so my journey with sustainability and long-term investment happened around that time. Now I was always interested in combining the social sector with the investment sector from 20 years ago. Then about 15 years ago, I launched a mutual fund in Japan called Commons Asset Management. This is a cross-generational investment mutual fund investing in Japanese companies for the next generation. So that's my long-term view. And within that, I came to the realization that as a long-term investor, investors always look at the financial results of a company. But as a long-term investor, looking at quarterly earnings, annual earnings are important to monitor the company, but that's not our goal. Our goal is to invest in companies that can create sustainable long-term value. And how do companies do that? Well, they're always adapting to the new environment, whether it's cultural or social. There's always gaps, needed gaps in the environment or society. And the companies are actually filling that gap. And that's how you create sustainable value. But most of the time, what the capital markets looks at is, well, guess what? The financial results of a company. And to me, that's just the tip of the iceberg. You see that, and the reason why you see that because you can put a number on it. But I believe most of the future creation of the value of the company it's actually non-financial. It's actually below the surface. So in my conversations with companies, we are not interested so much in the profitability this quarter of a company, but we're very interested in the value creation of the company. And that's an important point, I think. And also in the Japan context, you might know large Japanese companies that are already, that are globally present. Some of them are actually in this forum today. But if you think about it, 150 years ago in Japan, we were an emerging country. And back then, what did businesses do? They answered to social needs in the society to propel them into the new generation, a new era. And so, actually, if you think about it, corporations, at the core, it was all about social innovation, creating new social value, environmental value for a new society. As a side note, actually, my grandfather's grandfather, his name was Eiichi Shibusawa, was probably in this building about 153 years ago, back in 1867. He was one of the delegations from the last government in Japan before it modernized, sent an expedition to the Paris expedition, and he had a tutor, and he was a French banker. So he learned the banking system, he learned the securities system, and he took it back to Japan. And actually, if you think about it, Japan learned our capitalism from the French. And one of his most famous philosophies is you had to integrate the economics with responsibility. And the reason why you need that, to me, it's all about sustainability. I mean, if you're just going after the economic value for this quarter, well, you could burn up the planet, but if you make that, if you make that money, you're okay. But if you burn it up, you're not going to be making money in the future. So, being responsible for the planet, being responsible for the society, actually leads to the to the future creation of the company. You asked about the tools. And actually, I believe disclosure is a very, very important tool. Most corporations says, oh gosh, another round of disclosures, please, please, no. But actually, if you think about it, what long-term investors are looking for is not how well you're doing right now, in a sense, but just show us what is going on right now with your company. And if you're not going to make any improvements, well, we'll just go on to the next company. But if you show me what your current situation is, and you say to me, the company says, well, we're not satisfied with our current state. We want to be here, and we have this logic of going there. What does that signal? It's a buy signal for a long-term investor. So basically, disclosure, I think, is a tool to have constructive dialogue with long-term investment. A step further into the non-financial assets disclosures of the company is this concept of impact, which we can probably go more into detail later. The difference between ESG and impact, there's different ways of looking at it, but to me, ESG started with the deliberations in the United Nations, the PRI, Principle of Responsible Investment. That started the ESG back in 2005, 6, 7. But this was a financial investor-led initiative. So the investors was on the driver's seat, and the corporation says, "Oh my gosh, another round of disclosures." But that's the way it started, and it still is has that sort of element to it. To me, impact investing, some people say it's post-ESG, and the reason why I think it's post-ESG is this concept of impact started around in 2007-8 when it was first coined by the Rockefeller Foundation to support startups whose principal form of existence was to solve some social or environmental issue. That's their being. And the Rockefeller Foundation wanted to make sure that there was ample capital to support that kind of activity. Now that impact investing is not just in the startups, but it's being integrated into even listed companies' way of thinking about corporate value. So what's the difference is, if you think about it, in impact, I believe, who's in the driver's seat, it has to be the corporations, whether it's a small business or a large business, saying, hey, we have this impact, and we're not just saying we're doing good, but we're showing good. These are the metrics, and this is where we want to go. And to me, that's it's another way of saying, oh, this company is trying to create sustainable corporate value.
Well, thanks, Ken. I'm sure your ancestor will be very proud of his descendant today in the same place where he was, talking about responsible social capitalism. So so you talked about tools and the importance of disclosure, but to be able to disclose, you also need to be able to measure your impact. And I think that's where you come in, Kim, because in fact you you founded a company, Vested Impact, especially to use fintech, to use technology to assess and quantify positive and negative impacts of companies and to help them measure. And I think you leverage an impressive number of data points, like 300 million data points to be able to do this. You've also received numerous awards for your work in the UK and Australia. So congratulations for that. And you've also been selected as a PPF scale-up project. So one of the big challenges, as we said, is the measurement of non-financial impact. And you founded Vested Impact really to address this issue. So what are the specific issues you're trying to address, and how are you addressing them?
Thank you. So, I mean, fundamentally what we do is we automatically assess and quantify the impact of companies. But if we really want companies to drive change and to be better, then it's not just about assessing or rating them, right? It's also about helping them understand, what it is that they should be doing better. So the key problems that we really solve, both for investors but for the companies themselves, is firstly, how do they even know and understand what they have an impact on? What SDGs do they impact across all elements of their business? In the UK, there was a study recently. We hear a lot about greenwashing, and they actually said one of the largest forms of greenwashing that's happening at the moment is SDG washing, which is companies just throwing a logo on their website and saying, we're a bank, we must be helping poverty, right? So the first thing I often say is, well, we need to go deeper than just the 17 SDG goals. It's about the 169 targets underneath. Because really, if you want to be helping poverty, it is about helping the bottom % that earn less than $250 a day. It's about providing access to basic financial services. So the first thing we do, and I can get into the how in a moment, but it's about helping companies to assess and understand exactly what they have an impact on, positively and negatively. The SDG washing often comes about because a company will very happily often talk about everything they do well. When they get our report, they'll go, excellent. But it's equally important to talk about where you could do better. And that is about building trust. I think we all know many companies, it's impossible for them not to be generating some form of negative impacts. So when they're at least honest about that, it builds trust. But it also shows, to Ken's point, that they can see a future where they can improve that. So the second thing we then do is about the data, because first and foremost, a lot of the regulation and the requirements now require you to evidence and prove that. In the United Kingdom, the Advertising Standards Board in the UK says you can't even advertise in the market as green or good for planet unless you can provide science-based evidence that says that. So it is important, and that's where we can also help with data and the indicators to do that. But the second reason is also because it's one thing to say you're having an impact and contributing to an SDG, but how do you know how much? Because delivering a product or a service, delivering a mobile phone to a person in Australia can have a very different impact to if that phone went to someone in the global south. And so that is also about understanding the data and the context at which we're delivering products and services as companies. And then the final challenge we tried to solve was also, how do we help companies do this at scale? Because to do it properly, like an organization like La Poste Group, it's taken a lot of time and a skilled person like Stephanie to go through all the underlying activities that they do, all the product lines, and not all companies have that expertise, nor if you're an SME, you can't afford it. So for us, it was also about how do we do that at scale, and then how does that then turn into something like being able to assess your supply chain. So as a company, we have a data platform that basically automatically scrapes in information about companies. It breaks down those underlying activities. We leverage 200 million scientific literature and academic papers, which makes the causal link between how do we know that a mobile phone has an impact on access to mobile banking or access to affordable internet services. And then taking into account where they deliver these services for whom, we can pull on over 100 million impact data points. which is data from organizations like the UN, the World Bank, the OECD, Eurostat, organizations that can capture, is this really, are we improving these issues? And then, of course, how much do these companies contribute to that? And that we can all do in a matter of seconds, which obviously helps. Do we say what it does is it doesn't tell the companies, though, what they need to do about it. And that is then up to them as an organization to go, great, we usually, they have some great positive impacts, but there's always room for improvement. And that's the first step often for them, is knowing what they have an impact on, and for the investors to know where they're having an impact and where they can hopefully either provide financing or pressure to help those companies improve.
Okay, thanks. I mean, that sounds like an incredibly useful use of new technology. Thank you very much. You alluded to advertising standards and Ken alluded to disclosure requirements, which brings us a little bit to, what the role of the public sector is, what's the role of governments in trying to help companies or pressure companies. So, Stéphanie, vous avez eu
have a double perspective because you've worked in the public sector, now you work in the private sector, so you've gone sort of back and forth and cross borders. So have you discovered very different universes, different languages in these worlds? And what do you think public authorities, the governments, can do in order to help the private sector to move forward? Yes, it's true that I have moved between working in the French government and working in a company. I work at the La Poste Group, and I've worked in local authorities for nature and housing for the French government, and now I'm back at La Poste. So La Poste is a company which has also public shareholders, so it has quite a specific DNA, but it is a company at the end of the day, and it needs to be able to be profitable, and it needs to develop its business model and increase its turnover. So I discovered different worlds. I've discovered marketing experts, people who specialize in revenue generation. There's much more impact assessment than in the government authorities. In government, people create frameworks and sanctions and things like that. So here it's a bit different, of course, in the private sector. But the richness of my career path has really shown that what we need is, on the one hand, companies. There is a momentum today in the private sector, and we need the company's responsibility. And in France, we still need to work on our maturity when it comes to harnessing responsibility and fostering it. But when it comes to the example that I mentioned earlier on the being able to live on the planet, this is a challenge that isn't only a French one, it is something that is a challenge for everyone around the world, for all citizens, for all stakeholders. And I think that we do need a common approach, and in order to do that, we need the companies, we need citizens, and we need government. And I'd like to really stress this point, because as citizens, we don't always actually assume our own responsibilities. We expect the state to do everything, to finance, to sanction, to create these frameworks. But if we expect the state to do everything, we will not manage to achieve our goals. So we can expect governments to create a framework and to provide sanctions when it comes to initiatives that don't work or are not relevant or are not responsible. But we also want to have a state that shows the way to go and also imposes certain rules on companies and makes them respect it. So when it comes to La Poste, the group I work for, there's still work to be done. We know what we need to work on, but we're also proud to be able to show the road ahead and to take leadership. So, for example, in our group, we have perfect gender equality when it comes to salaries. So we want to inspire, we want to be an example to follow, and we think that the state also has to be inspiring, and that's something that we expect them to do, to set a role model in a certain way. When it comes to legislation, I was at the head of a part of the French administration where there were many norms, many standards, many different laws, and I'm afraid that there might be too much bureaucracy and too much red tape and too much data and reporting obligations, and that we might basically not turn a blind eye to impact. And impact is important, so we need to see what the impact of the measures are. So really there is this red line for companies that we need to follow. We need to deploy CSRD and to be able to strengthen sustainability, decarbonation, and all the different circular economy issues, to preserve biodiversity, to keep our societal and social commitments, but doing reporting and transparency, of course, but not forgetting our impact. So we need to keep an eye on that. So maybe later I have a question to ask Kim on the advice she might have to give us to help companies follow a path that isn't, because companies, well, the state actually likes rules and standards, but companies like that too because it provides security. And I think that that isn't really the tone of the 21st century, and we won't be able to guarantee a planet that we can live in using this approach. So we need to change gears, change the approach. We need a new sort of accountability, a new kind of budget. We're deploying a carbon budget that's parallel to the Euro budget, and tomorrow we'll have another budget in square cubic feet of water and land, and it's really changing the paradigm for all of us. No, thank you. That's an interesting approach, this change of approach.
Changing the paradigm in a way. And at the same time, I think you've also worked a lot with governments, and you found that governments and companies speak different languages. So how can we change the paradigm in a way that both sides understand? And also, I think you have also been concerned that there's been too much focus on environmental part of the E of the ESG and less on the S, the social impact. So would you like to speak a bit about those?
Okay, thank you, Daphne. You talk about new paradigm. The Prime Minister of Japan, Kishida-san, when he assumed office in the autumn of 2021, he established this concept of the new form of capitalism. Why do you need a new form of capitalism? Because there was something wrong with the old form, obviously. A new paradigm is necessary. And I've had the honor of serving on the council ever since its inception. From my vantage point, though, the concept, the narrative took off on the wrong feet, because they were talking about distribution policy initially, and especially the financial markets said, "Hey, that's not capitalism. That's socialism." So it kind of started out on the wrong feet. But there are some concepts in the new form of capitalism, but I think that's very, very important. One is this concept of human capital. And I mentioned earlier that the company's corporate value see the financial assets, but there's also non-financial assets. If you think about it, or better to say non-financial value, the biggest non-financial value, if you had to put one category in, I think it's the people that actually work, the human capital in that company. But we were able to push this idea that you should be able to asking the corporations to do more disclosure on the human capital side of the equation to see that that there's actually value creation there. The second very important issue that was taken up by the council that was in the final paper is this concept of impact. And if you think about value creation in the financial markets, it always thinks in two dimensionals, risk and return. it takes a very complex value proposition. You put it on a piece of paper in 2 dimensions. It's very, very easy to see. So that becomes a common language. But this concept of impact is you're going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. You're putting another dimension up, saying you're solving solutions that's required in the environment or society. So you're going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, you know, which makes things a little bit more complicated. And some people say we don't need that complexity, but you know, we live in a 3-dimensional world, so I don't think that it's kind of that big of a leap of a faith. But because the concept of impact was in this government paper, actually caused a buzz in Japan in the impact community in terms of impact investing. There's another parallel movement about impact weighted accounting for public companies as well. And so having the government involved and saying this is impact is important, which is an issue to think about, it really started a kind of a movement. So the government definitely has a role, I think, in terms of forming the narrative, the guide, you know, the guiding the sort of the flow. However, I always felt that the government in the private sector always lacked a common language. Many of you are aware of the PPP, public-private sector partnerships. It's a great concept, and some of them do work. But if you think about it, what is that common language? Well, corporations look for sales and profits, right? That's their goal. In the public sector government, well, they spend a lot of time on the budget process, getting that money for that budget, and assume that it gets done, right? Sometimes it doesn't get done. But there was this lack, I believed, in this common language between the public sector and the private sector. But if we get this metrics right about the impact, that may become, you know, the common language. Now, I'm a long-term investor, and long-term investors has to be optimistic. Otherwise, we can't invest long-term. So I might be being overly optimistic about this common language, but it's a language that's different from the financial language that the investors traditionally have used, or the budgeting process the government has originally used. So I think, you know, I think that's one area that I think we should be looking at. The one thing that really is concerning, probably for most of you as well, is this concept of ESG investment, which is very important, I believe. It's illegal in some states in the United States, which you feel like, it's like, you know, you might think from a European context, you know, Americans, that kind. But if you think about it, E got so digitalized. Why I say digitalized, it's you could put a number on it and say, how much CO2 equivalent are you emitting? And it's a 0-1 game. You're green 0 or no, net 0 or 1, you know. And what happened, well, it was easy to put a number on it, so it got people's attention, and it was a very important initial stage. But I think a lot of people also got threatened by it, because a lot of people actually depend their livelihoods on carbon-emitting industries. And so to me, E kind of went way ahead, and S kind of got left behind. And so I think we need this equilibrium for having the S. And what is that common language for S? And I'm thinking, well, whether you're French, Japanese, or African, health is one common language, I think, for all. And so I'm hoping that the health metrics will be a common language for S. Currently, we're in the process, we have launched this initiative called Triple I for Global Health. Global health is access to medicine, healthcare for all, right? Whether you're in France or Japan or the emerging countries, and the Triple I stands for Impact Investment Initiative, and this was actually endorsed by the G7 Hiroshima Summit in May of last year, and we had our launch event during the UN General Assembly Week in September in New York. I'm one of the co-heads. Another gentleman, Mr. Steve Davis, he used to be the CEO of PATH. Also works with the Gates Foundation in China, very, very smart businessman. There's another co-head, and the third co-head is an African woman from Nigeria in global health. Her name is Dr. Yodi Alakija, very, very dynamic woman. And so the three of us are co-heads and trying to start this initiative saying, hey, you know, global health always needed private sector money to come in. And donations, grants from the private sector is very, very important. But if you're asking a corporation to make that kind of grants, well, it's going to be limited. But if it's global health is seen as a growth strategy, and the reason I say that is when you think about health issues, you think about the cost. Well, if it's a cost, it sells to somebody else. And so if you use this concept of impact, plus the fact that there are sales involved in revenue, profits, maybe it's a way to get, you know, new form of capital going into answering global health, and this S, the common language for S, maybe through the global health.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, great. So S also stands for SMEs. Yes, and we're talking about big companies here, but how do SMEs navigate all this complexity?
And I think that's a really good question, because a lot of the pressure, the social pressure and the regulation sits on big corporates. But the reality is, when we talk about economies and society, that's the tip of the iceberg. There's 300 million SMEs in the world, which, I mean, put aside that, and I'll get onto that in a moment, the pressures they're now facing, that's 300 million companies that can also have the power to help us actually make these change, which I think is really important, that we can't forget that we not only need to enable them and help them to fit into a lot of this regulation, but we need to also empower them to be part of the change. So with SMEs, and it was something we've focused on a lot with Vested Impact, is from next year, because of the CSRD regulation in Europe, 92% of large buying corporations, this is large companies, are going to require their supply chain of SMEs to be reporting ESG and sustainability metrics. Financing, whether that is loan and debt financing from financial institutions or venture capital investment, is increasingly being tied to an SME being able to prove and evidence their impact. And in some countries even, at the point of formalizing your company, at the point of registering a company, you have to now also be able to kind of answer what you are going to do about the potential sustainability and social impacts of your firm. And this is actually hugely problematic for SMEs, because from the processes that Stephanie has talked about, it's incredibly time-consuming, it's incredibly costly for them, and they quite simply often, they don't have the expertise. And so that's something at Vested we've been focusing a lot, because that's where technology and data can come in. We can automatically assess and attribute the impact materiality assessments for a company. They can know exactly what they have an impact on where. They have immediate access to data that can help them evidence that and report that. But they also then have this tool that helps them to understand where they start to also improve themselves, because they well know now, if they sit in La Poste's supply chain, or they're pitching to one of the funds that can manages, that they are going to get asked these questions. But also, if they can show that they're on top of it, they can do that. And we're really, I mean, currently we assess and automatically assess the impact of over 25,000 companies. But we're about to announce for next year some funding that's going to allow us to cover and assess the impact of millions, at least 1.2 million SMEs, which again, I can't emphasize enough that we actually need to engage and empower SMEs with the data so that they can understand and manage their impacts, not because it's good business, which obviously it is, but because it's quite possibly not just the best chance, it might be the only chance we have to collectively solve the SDGs.
Okay, well, yeah, very important. IC is actually also launching a report on the impact of regulatory requirements on SMEs at COP28, so that's a very important issue. We have just a few minutes left for questions from the audience. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? No. Yes, there's the gentleman over there, a lady over there, sorry. Yeah.
Good afternoon, thank you. My name is Jennifer Baren and I work for AGRA in Africa, in Nairobi, where we work across 15 countries to basically transform agriculture. It's fantastic what you're stating and what companies are able to do, and we also work with private sector to make it happen. But do you have any recommendation in terms of how companies can work together in a pre-competitive space to actually increase not just only the impact that they have, but also how do they measure it and how they account for it? And this is basically for any one of you. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start with the measurement, because we get asked this a bit actually from development finance banks that actually say to us, can we assess, if we give you the data on 8 million SMEs in Africa, can you assess them for us and tell us who's having an impact where on what, so that they can then identify who they can partner with? Because a lot of the current financing will often go, well, gee, there's a gap in, in sustainable agri-tech here, and they think that means there's a lack of companies, which, as you well know, that does not mean that at all. And they put money into investing in new organizations where they could have been existing. So what I guess the first step we would say is we kind of help unearth that data to prove and try and evidence with data why someone doing biohusk char, which is an organic fertilizer that absorbs carbon, why we can scientifically prove that works, why that will have an impact on agricultural productivity. And then I guess it throws to then the organizations to go, well, does that align then with whatever they're trying to deliver or what they're financing? But for us, that's the first step, is about just trying to then prove and provide that data to make these investments financeable. A lot of banks say to us, we'll say, why don't you invest in the Global South? And they'll say, oh, because there's not enough data. That's not acceptable anymore. There's plenty of data, and it's then about them making the decisions.
And there's one thing about the data is the fact that you could be measuring a lot of data, but people get overloaded with data sometimes. And so I think you have to start with trial and error in any industry, what that measurement is. But having, the data is very important, I think, for the analyst to find and go through all the numbers, right? But for the final decision making, you can't be looking at all this kind of data. So we have to be going through this process to figure out in agriculture in Africa, the yield might be very, very important, but it's also creating jobs and a lot of other metrics, right? And so, but we don't have this magic bullet right now, I think, in terms of measurement. But I think through this trial and error, with your services and other services, I think we'll being an optimist, we'll come to that conclusion.
Just
to add something, because you spoke a lot about data and the agricultural sector, for example, but in the agriculture we are talking about something living, about ecosystems as well. So I think that we also have to go beyond competitions, because beyond agricultural practices, this has an impact. Agriculture has an impact on soil erosion, on water retention, and this is something that is then borne by different players, and there's a sort of chain of responsibilities, a chain of consequences on these different players. So we're all in a sort of united system today. So we do have to move forward and understanding that we are all part of a joint system. And because we are a system, we do have to cooperate, especially in agriculture, for example. And so it's not just a question of yields or profit. It's also an issue of soil erosion, and you have to understand that when the soil's no longer alive, well, agriculture is no longer possible. So I agree that data is important, but data for data's sake is not the way to go either. And before the but behind the CSRD, there's only a quarter of these standards that are based on quantitative norms. The rest of them, 75% of these points, are qualitative issues. So how we translate these qualitative points into data is another issue. It's a sort of question I have, yes.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we've run out of time, but I think it was really good to stop on that point, and the question of impact being more important than quantity or data. So thank you very, very much to our three discussants here, and thank you to all of you for having joined us. Have a good rest of the Paris Peace Forum. Thank you.